Alrighty, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. We're here at WTD Atlantic 2024. My name is Ali Dowair, and I'm here to talk to you about what's in a word, lessons from localizing the Kubernetes documentation to Arabic. Now, a little bit about me is hello again, my name's Ali. I'm Egyptian born and raised, and I work as a software engineer. I actually use Kubernetes at work for a living. And that's what got me into this whole documentation world. Now, outside of that, I like to take pictures, and I do what some people like to call involuntary yoga. Ask me about that later. Now, before we get into the meat of things, I want to start by going over the title again. Lessons learned from localizing Kubernetes documentation. Well, first, what is localization? Well, it's the process of adapting a product or content to a local market. Now, this can be done by changing the marketing copy, changing features of the product itself, visuals, branding, but it can also apply to things like documentation. Now, localization is important, so much so, in fact, that CSA Research, which has a whole division dedicated to this, found out in 2020 that 40% of online consumers don't buy or won't buy from commerce websites in a foreign language. Now, I know, yes, we're talking about commerce here, we're talking about a business transaction, but I want to make a case that localization is important for documentation too, especially for open source documentation. See, open source projects have little to no financial incentive backing them, right? They're projects made by passionate people to share them with other passionate people to solve some real world problem. And unlike a business where you do have an incentive to grow, to expand to new markets, that doesn't exist in open source. Really, it's a pull model rather than a push model. And that's why I think it's really, really important to pay attention to localizing projects like these, because you never know who might actually really, really need your technology, who may not be in the market because they don't know it exists. So with that being said, let's talk about Kubernetes. What is it? Well, I mentioned that it's an open source project. It enables you to manage applications in a fault-tolerant and scalable way. And it's hugely popular. It's all the hotness right now. But it is quite complex. And that's what makes it a really good candidate for this talk, is that there is a lot of terminology built into Kubernetes that's domain-specific. And there's a lot to say about that. So, we know what localization is and why it's important. And we know a little bit about Kubernetes. Now let me tell you the story of how our project came together. And the first step, as always, in any superhero movie is form a team. And the story starts a long, long time ago, somewhere in the corners of GitHub, where some passionate fellow decided that they wanted to work on this. And they opened an issue and talked about it. It didn't seem to go anywhere. And that happened a few times over the years. In fact, over the last 6 years. And when I went out to look at those issues, what was clear is that there's a lot of interest in the community for this kind of project. In fact, Arabic is not the first localization effort. It's, I think, the 13th or the 14th in the Kubernetes community. And yet, until the beginning of this year, it didn't seem like there was a cohesive effort. Something changed at the beginning of this year, and that is the organizers of the Kubernetes project, the maintainers, decided that this time they were going to step in and lend a hand, unite everyone who's interested in this project, and provide the logistical support. And with that, a team was formed, a team of passionate contributors and a team of maintainers that believed in the purpose of this project. I suppose the first lesson right away before we talk about localization is, like any project, you need a supportive team, right? Documentation, especially if you live in the software world, is a cross-vertical effort, right? It's not just the job of technical writers. It's the job of writers, engineers, marketers, directors, the whole thing. Building a team that is aligned on purpose is the first step to any kind of success. So now we've got a team. The next step is to lay the groundwork, right? Kubernetes documentation is hosted on a website, kubernetes.io, and that's built on a bunch of different open source tools and frameworks. And we need to get those ready to receive our new content. And right away, we saw something really great, which is that the Kubernetes banner at the top of the kubernetes.io page renders really, really pretty in English and in left-to-right languages. But when we try to render it in right to left, which is the direction of Arabic, we see that it doesn't render quite properly. Cue a lot of work to try to figure out what was going on here, and I'll forewarn you by saying that if you get motion sickness, this would be a good time to look away from the screen and just listen to me. There's going to be a lot of scrolling. But the team, maintainers, and people outside the Kubernetes community put a lot of effort into figuring out what the issue was. And what it turned out to be is that a long, long time ago, when the Kubernetes documentation was being built, some custom CSS was put into the project. Not knowing, of course, that this had anything to do with language direction, this was put in to enhance some visual elements. What ended up happening is the Kubernetes project created forks of other open source dependencies and tailored them to a particular purpose. And that tailoring actually ended up messing up the RTL rendering. And there was a lot of effort, as you can see, to actually align with the open source doxy. And a lot of work was put into this. And we're really grateful for the people who stepped in, because this is a huge deal. And as you can see now, we're just getting to the end of the scrolling here. And a lot of people were involved, so this is me thanking them for putting in the work. And once that's done now, well, nominally at least, we now have a functioning website that can accommodate for our new content. The lesson here is internationalize. Internationalize is the word used to describe what we just talked about. It's preparing your infrastructure to be accepting of localizations. The first thing to do is to make sure that those things are there. If you're interested in localizing your project, your first step is make sure your infrastructure is there. Some other things to be mindful of is to support different language directions. Parameterize things like labels and buttons for different lengths of text that will live inside them. And along the same lines, use flexible containers for varying length paragraphs and words. Great. So we have our infrastructure. We can actually start localizing now. And the first task is to localize Kubernetes. No, not the project, the word itself. The word itself means something, and you and I now know it as this open source project. But when we come to translate it or talk to someone new about it, it has to make sense. We try to research what the origin of the word is. And it's actually an ancient Greek word. It means navigator or guide. See, Kubernetes is a project that came out of or came alongside another project called Docker. And Docker started off with a nautical theme. Docker with docks and containers on a ship. Kubernetes extends that paradigm. And now we arrive at this word, which we had to somehow fit into the Arabic lexicon. So the question was raised, do we translate the word or do we transliterate it? And there's a few considerations here that I want to share with you. Now, if you're looking at a word and you're trying to figure out how to localize it to a different language, ask yourself first, is it a common or a proper noun? Is it a brand name or a generic object? Second, is there a theme involved? If there is a theme, it may be worthwhile to translate, but not always. And thirdly, has it been translated to other languages before? And of course, given all these considerations and what we know now, transliterating made sense to us, at the time at least. And of course, the hilarity ensues in trying to translate a word from a Latin alphabet to the Arabic abjad. And so the team worked really, really hard to try to generate ideas for which word makes sense. And we had many, many candidates. And you can see here, there are all kinds of funny pronunciations, but the point is that the team of 5 or 6 of us weren't really able to sit down and figure out what is the most quote-unquote correct phonetic pronunciation of the word. I mean, because each one of us had a different accent of English, right? So when we even say Kubernetes in English, it comes out to a different Arabic spelling. Now, we ended up choosing the very last of these that you see on the screen for a couple of reasons that may not be intuitive, but did make sense to us eventually and did pay off. See, it's 8 letters long, which is the same length as the word in English. So it works well with the numeronym K8S. It's really neat. But more importantly, this is the transliteration that Google uses. And so we ended up choosing this, and I guess the lesson here is transliterate appropriately. Aim for consistency, not just or not always linguistic correctness. It's okay to follow precedent, especially since what we're doing here is we're adding knowledge to a cohesive body rather than coming up with something new. And think about computers, not just human readers, right? We have these free and open translators that we rely on for a lot of our work, and that people sometimes unintentionally or implicitly rely on when they, for example, use an auto-translation option in their browser. Great. So now we've got the word Kubernetes figured out. The next step is to look at keywords. Now remember I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that Kubernetes is a complex project and it's got a lot of domain-specific terminology. Some of the first ones that we thought about translating, and the ones that we had problems with, are these three here. Now the first one on the left here is the unlabeled logo for a Kubernetes cluster. The one in the middle is for a Kubernetes node, and the one on the right is for a Kubernetes pod. And all these three concepts are related. Now cluster is the main Kubernetes management unit. It's an object that you create that manages a set of nodes for you. A node, in turn, is a single computer or server that's a part of a cluster. Now, this can be your laptop, it could be a server in a rack, or a virtual machine. Any kind of computer joins a cluster as a node. And a node runs applications inside of pods on behalf of the cluster. Lastly, then, a pod is the smallest management unit in Kubernetes, and it represents a single instance of a particular application. Say, for example, you've got a web server that's got 3 replicas. Each one of those, alongside its configuration and settings, would live in a pod. Now, why is translating these a challenge? Well, these words, if you remove the context that I just built for you, don't seem to be related to one another at first. And what makes this even more challenging is that for each one of those literal words, there are many, many different synonyms or variants or options to translate to Arabic. Let me demonstrate. So if we try to translate the word cluster, you come up with 2 ideas immediately. First is a cluster of stars or a galaxy, what we would say in Arabic, majarra. Or cluster can also be used to express something like a cluster of grapes on a vine, anqud. 2 very different themes. They came from the same word in English, cluster, but they're 2 different words in Arabic. Now let's see how this falls through into node. If we carry on this theme of grapes on a vine, the first term that could come up to mind is uqda for node, a node on a branch. But uqda isn't just a node on a branch, it could also be a knot in wood in general. And what makes things even worse is there's even a third word that you can translate from node, which is ghudda, like a lymph node. Now, to make the nightmare even worse, we can take a look at pod, which is completely separate from what we just talked about. You put pod into an open free translator and you get a word like qarn, which is a pod of peas. You get jarab, which is a sack or a pouch. And then you get hujayra, which is a compartment. All of those 3 things can be described as pods in English, and yet they're different words in Arabic. How do we pick ones? What's probably most important here is to maintain context when we're picking out translations for these words. And that's what was really challenging, is these 3 words are related to each other inside the Kubernetes project. When you remove the Kubernetes context, they're a little less related. And we try to translate them over to Arabic, the relationships don't quite keep up. And it took a little bit of digging back, but we understood the context finally. If you remember, just a few slides ago, I said that Kubernetes is related to the project Docker, which has a nautical theme. And within Docker, there's this term container, which is related to pod, the pod that we're talking about here. And so what we thought would make most sense then here is that pod be translated to hujayra, as in a pod in a ship. And that's what we ended up with here. 2 different themes, anqud and uqda for cluster and node, going off of the grape theme, and hujayra for pod, going off of the nautical theme. And I suppose the lesson to learn here is to translate contextually, not just literally. technical words will probably have themes attached to them. It may be necessary to construct new themes, but not always. If you find yourself in that situation, think really, really hard about what that new theme is going to be and if you can relate it to the existing themes. Great. So now we've got our keywords. Let's actually start writing. And we ran into challenges yet again. This is going to be the theme of the presentation here, which is the challenge of sentence structure and grammar. See, one thing to know about Arabic is it's got a really flexible sentence structure. So do all Semitic languages, actually. I myself, when I would sit down to translate a file, what I would find myself doing often is I would sit down, I'd read the English text word for word, and I would translate it as I was going along. And what ended up happening is when I would review my results, or when one of my teammates would review my results, the words didn't make sense. They weren't really sentences. And that's because the sentence structure in Arabic is a little different from the sentence structure in English. And it's also variable, right? Not every sentence in Arabic is written in the same structure. Let me try to demonstrate this with a simple example. Let's say that I want to express this idea that me, Ali, reads a book. Now, if you look at these three words on the screen, I'm going to read them out and say, قرأ علي الكتاب. The first word on the right-hand side, قرأ, means read. علي is my name. الكتاب is the book. And you'll notice that there's these little symbols colored in red and green. And those are called diacritics, and what they do in Arabic is they describe or specify what in a sentence is the subject and the object in a typical verb, subject, object structure. The interesting thing about Arabic is that you can dance these around or play around with them to change the meaning of a sentence without changing the word order. So here we've got Ali reads a book, and the green matches with green, and the red matches with red. But if I flip around the diacritics, I can actually change the meaning of the sentence to be the opposite while keeping the words in the same order. قرأ عليا الكتاب means a book read or reads Ali. Now that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, I know, but it is possible to construct such a sentence in Arabic. Now, this is a simple example, I know, and when you remove the diacritics, it still should be clear what the meaning of the sentence is. قرأ علي الكتاب probably means that Ali read a book as opposed to the other way around. But try or consider translating a more complex idea. Let's say that the Kube API server is managing the kubelet in order to deploy pods. Right? You've got three objects, you've got two relationships. How do you know, without understanding those terms, how they relate to one another? So I suppose the lesson here is to write clear and precise sentences. Try to digest the meaning of a sentence before translating it, and avoid implicit references, things like pronouns. Try to identify objects and subjects explicitly so that the relationships between them are clear to the reader. Great. So we are writing sentences. Things should be okay, right? Well, not really, because we figured out that dialects are also something we have to deal with. And this is actually an example that came up in one of the documents we were trying to translate, is the word problem. Now, I've got on the left-hand side and the right-hand side here the exact same word in masculine and feminine forms. Arabic is one of the languages that does have gendered terms or gendered nouns. On the right-hand side, I've got the word mushkila, meaning problem in the feminine form. And on the left-hand side, I've got mushkil, a problem in the masculine form. And both of these are used in the Arab world depending on where you come from. In the eastern part of the Arab world, the feminine form is used on the right-hand side. And in the western part of the Arab world, the masculine form, mushkil, is used. What makes things even worse is I can add diacritics to the left-hand side version, mushkil, to make something completely different. I would add those three diacritics to give me the word mushakkel, which actually means mixed, like a salad bowl or a sandwich mixed. So that's completely different. In Arabic text, usually in print, diacritics are excluded, and it's often left to the reader to figure out what the word or the meaning of a sentence is. In technical documentation, we don't have that leeway because we are often describing brand new ideas. So this is a problem. We have to figure it out. And we did, and I'll talk about the solution here. But before I do that, I want you to imagine if all documentation was not in US or UK English. And I mean all documentation, right? The instructions on your washing machine, the label on your coffee cup, your favorite open source project. I think we all take for granted the fact that we speak this same common dialect that dominates the globe. And I suppose the lesson learned here is to make sure to write in a dialect-neutral way. Use clear and simple phrases that can be understood the same way by people who speak multiple dialects. Be mindful of slang. It's often related to cultural context, and that's not always the same across dialectic groups. And if the differences are big, it might be worthwhile to create a localization for each dialect. As is actually the case in the Kubernetes project, we have 2 localizations in Portuguese, one for Brazilian and one for Portuguese in Portugal. And the very last one here is cultural context. Now, this is something I wanted to touch up a little bit on. I want you to consider this phrase. The server is occupied with serving the old requests. It sounds like a typical sentence you'd find in technical documentation. And we put that whole sentence into an online translator. You get a sentence that makes sense. الخادم مشغول بخدمة الطلبات القديمة. The server is busy serving old requests. But I want you to consider what happens if I truncate the original sentence in English. And I do something like, the server is occupied, say at the end of a sentence. The issue here arises when I pass that through an online translator and I get a phrase like al-khadimu muhtal. Muhtal here doesn't mean busy, it means occupied in a very different sense. See, it evokes colonial occupation, land occupation. Now, it's certainly not the purpose or the point of an online translator to evoke that image, and we're not really here to discuss how it came to be or why it's relevant in the world, other than to know that it's a big part of the experience of people who speak Arabic. And it is something that we have to be mindful of. I'll give you an example that's outside of Arabic. See, this is a global problem. Some of the terms in the technical sphere that have fallen out of fashion in computing are master and slave, for the obvious connotation that we are all aware of, but that a non-English speaker might not be aware of. See, in Arabic, when you translate those 2 words, they don't necessarily relate to one another in the way that they do in English. And so that might be lost on someone whose first language is Arabic, who's not aware of that context. And it's important that they do be aware. What I'm trying to say here is that this goes in all directions. We all have a responsibility to be aware of those cultural contexts and what they mean for the people who are trying to address or communicate with. Now, let me lighten the mood a little bit with a story kind of like this in the same vein, but that's maybe funny and a little vulgar. The Hyundai Kona, a car that was released globally under that name, but in Portugal was released under a different name, the Hyundai Kauai. I'll let you do the research after this presentation on what that means in Portuguese, but the point being here is that we need to be writing for the world. Every language has some cultural context surrounding it. We need to work to understand that cultural context. And sometimes, and I know we mean well, neutral is not neutral, and we really do have to put in some effort when we're trying to bridge those gaps. And that brings us to today, a story with 7 lessons. Let's take a look at where we are today and presently in the future. Our next steps with the project are to complete the internationalization work with Doxy, to finish off localizing the terminology and the rest of the pages on the website. And we're planning to be releasing by version 1.32, which should be coming up late this year or early next year. And our vision for the future with that being released is to expand the language, expand the landscape, so that Arabic can accommodate talking about this technology. See, I'm not any different from any of you folks, but English is not my first language. And I'm really, really lucky to know it this well, to be able to participate with you in a conference like this and many others. But not a lot of people have that opportunity. And what we're hoping to do here is to open the door for those people who are passionate about open source, who are passionate about technology, who may just be a language barrier away from contributing. And their contributions are just as valid as anyone else's because they're bright minds and they're smart. They have good values just like anyone else. So, to recap, your localization checklist has 7 steps on it. First, build a supportive team. Second, prepare your infrastructure, internationalize. Third, maintain your brand and brand consistency. Fourth, translate themes, not words. Fifth, use clear and concise sentences. Sixth, accommodate for dialects. And finally, understand cultural context. Now I want to leave you with one of my favorite Arabic proverbs here. لا تتهم كل الناس بالعمى إن كنت لا ترى الشمس. Don't accuse everyone of blindness if you yourself cannot look at the sun. And with that, I want to say thank you so much for the time you've spent with me today. Preparing and giving this presentation has been a real pleasure. If you're interested in hearing more of my thoughts, I've got my URL for my blog up there where I do a little bit of writing about this topic and others. I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and to attending the rest of the sessions in this conference. Enjoy the rest of the 3 days. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.
All right. Hello. Can you hear me?
Hello, hello. How's it going?
Oh my God. I can hear you. You can hear me. Hopefully everyone else can too, or else we're just talking to ourselves. Thank you for kicking off day 2. I know it's always a feat, and we appreciate you being here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for all the work you've done. It's been a great day 1, and I'm excited for the rest of the talks too. So again, thanks for having me.
Amazing. We had so much engagement during your talk, and I saw you were also active in the chat. Love to see it. So let's dive in. The most requested question is, do you keep a glossary or dictionary for contributors?
Yes, that's a great question, and we learned the hard way that that's something we have to keep. There is actually a page on the Arabic, so it's a published page when you go to the Kubernetes website that has a guide for when you translate this word, here's the one that we're using in our documentation.
Amazing. Okay, you said the hard way. What happened?
Yes,
if you're willing to share.
So we are a team of about 5 to 6. Actually, we're all engineers, software engineers who came into documentation through the tech. And we were working asynchronously on all of our pieces of work. It came out much later when we were reviewing one another's work at our milestone checkpoints that we were using different terms in Arabic for the same things in English. And there was a whole, we had to do a whole rerun of all our documentation to make them consistent. And so, when we had that experience, we reached out to the Kubernetes organizers and they mentioned that, hey, the Korean team is doing this thing. They've got a glossary. Why don't you make one too? So that's how we arrived at what we have today.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, that happens even within the same language. You might notice that people are using similar terms for this, like to refer to the same thing, and keeping that consistency, as you mentioned in your presentation, is extremely important. And then, do you have any automation behind that, like any linters or checking?
It's a great question. We don't, unfortunately. What I will say is that the Kubernetes team at large is looking at bringing automation into the process, not just for us, but for all of the, I think, 15 teams at this point. So hopefully, if anyone in the audience knows of tools or has experience, please, we'd love to learn from your experience, because we're trying to manage the scale on the Kubernetes docs, and it is quite big, and if we can make our lives easier, if you know how to, please let me know.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm sure it's a completely different game between, maybe a smaller project with a fewer number of pages, fewer number of things versus like, something like Kubernetes, which just is on a totally different scale. So then when it comes to translations, do you also translate code examples? And how do you decide like which technical terms there to keep maybe in English versus not? Thinking, for example, tool names, variables. For example, I was surprised when you were talking about translating Kubernetes, like the name, because in my mind I was like, oh, it's a name, but it does make sense to kind of figure out what the root is and move through that. So very curious about your thoughts on that.
For sure, yeah. So it's an interesting question. I do appreciate you asking. So when it comes to code, right, that we are bounded by, I want to say historical reasons, right? The
Mm-hmm.
computers were, let's say, the last stretch of computing was pioneered by people who spoke English, and as such, all the machines were designed with that in mind, and so all the mainstream programming languages and scripting languages today are written in the Latin alphabet. And so, there are, let's say, experimental programming languages and non-Latin alphabets, but those don't have traction in the industry or at an industrial level. So to answer the first part of the question is code is still in English for the most part. We might be localizing the comments that are accompanying each command or each result.
Mm-hmm.
But it is a reality that if you are a software engineer or a coder, you must know English. That is just the name of the game.
Yeah, absolutely. But I also think I love your arguments for language inclusivity because just because something is like that now doesn't mean that it needs to be something that we perpetuate and we continue. And there isn't really, I mean, for some people, of course, there's a reason, but we can always try to like push that change forward. And I appreciate you putting in that work and really advocating for that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that comment. I mean, we are on a cusp of, with generative AI, we are on a cusp of a lot of, let's say, production in our space. And I do look forward to a time when you can code in your own natural spoken language and somehow, somewhere that gets translated to common machine code. That would be really lovely. I do love that idea.
Oh my gosh, fascinating. You mentioned AI. It's almost like you see my question list. So my next question has to do with AI. Which is, in your opinion, is it better to have AI or otherwise auto-generated translation for your documentation or no translation at all?
Whew. Oh, that's a good question. So there are, you gain something and you lose something with each option, right? So it's a bit of a matrix. How I see it, if you don't translate your documentation at all, the only people who are able to read it are those who are able to read in that language, if even if they're not fluent or don't have a full mastery of it. And so your total, let's say, we can think about it in economic terms, your total market size is smaller, but your penetration is arguably maybe higher because the original source documentation in the original language, we can say it's been written with full fidelity. Now, on the other hand, if you use, let's say, AI-generated translations for all languages, you expand your total market size hugely, but you don't get full fidelity or as high fidelity translations. I think it's up to the project maintainers what it is that they need. I myself am going to advocate, of course, for yes, have translations even if they're not accurate. The chance that you are going to mess up tragically, just like we saw in the presentation earlier, are so low, and I'm sure that's not anyone's intention to do that. It's the kind of thing that it's good to be mindful of, but I'm someone who believes that in open source and in tech in general, I believe that people have best intentions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you're working in a corporation, you'll have legal teams, you'll have things like that you can run that by to make sure that there aren't any issues with that. If someone is auto-generating their documentation or auto-generating their translated documentation with something like AI, do you think that they should have that as a notice or like put that somewhere in the documentation to say, this is what we're doing?
Yeah, that's a great question and suggestion, actually. That may be something that we do, because we do use or do rely on generative AI for our translation. Of course, we read through the generated content and comb through it manually as well. It does help out in our workflow, and I think uh, if someone is to rely purely on AI generated content, having that disclaimer is probably a good idea. I mean, I think that's what exists in Google Chrome today. Even if a website doesn't have it built in, you can ask the browser to translate the text, and you'll get a
Hmm.
banner at the top saying, "Hey, this has been translated from so and so to so and so."
Oh yeah, I use that all the time living in Germany. I mean, I speak German, but sometimes it's just nice to no thoughts head empty, translate the page and be like, I'll figure it out if it sounds a little weird. So then if
You
we're
know,
going into, oh yeah, sorry, please.
I was just going to corroborate that comment. I mean, I speak two languages fluently, but sometimes I just really do enjoy reading certain things in a particular language. So there might be something in Arabic that I'll just translate to English because I am more comfortable that way, and vice versa. So I totally understand that. And I imagine that a lot of people in the audience do as well.
I mean, there's also something to say that people are probably already doing this with documentation. You know, they might already be using like in browser translations. So you providing that is just kind of like acknowledging, like, hey, we recognize that this might be more comfortable for you. So I love that. And then if we're going into dialects quickly,
Yes.
is you mentioned that once a dialect is maybe big enough or has enough differentiations to have two separate localizations for it, or however many. How do you make that determination? What makes a dialect like big enough, I guess?
Oh wow. I think the people in the Portuguese teams would be more equipped to answer that question. But what I will say is, I guess it's driven by demand, right? There was a time when there was just the Portuguese in Portugal localization, and I think at some point someone reached out to the Kubernetes team and said, "Hey, we are a company based out of Brazil, and we speak Portuguese too, but some of this documentation doesn't make sense. Can we get one in our own dialect?" And so, to answer your question, there is no formal or official science behind it, right? And at the end of the day, just like everything we do in the strand of inclusivity, it's in response to the demand of the people who need it, who express that desire of, hey, I have this thing, I'd like it to be represented in the content that I'm consuming.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We also had that whole debate of, which dialects do you choose? And sometimes it's nice to know that, like, okay, you can also let your users kind of guide that. You can be like, who are we, like, where are our main markets? What are people wanting? What kind of feedback are we receiving? So thank you so much. And then because we only have a minute left, where can people find you? We had so many questions. Where can people talk to you about this?
Yeah, I'd love to. Yes, I really do appreciate all the engagement in the chat. Thank you all for just chatting with me and everyone else. So I have a LinkedIn. I think that would probably be the best way to reach me cross-platform. I'm in the Kubernetes and the Cloud Native Computing Foundation Slacks, but those are less reliable. And you can also just go to my website. That's ali.dowair.com. That's ali.dowair.com. I'll just drop that in the chat as well. And you should have
Amazing.
something there for how to reach me. And yes, I would absolutely love to talk more about this. And I saw that there's a bunch of people in the audience who do this kind of thing for work as well. So I'd love to hear your experiences.
Great. Thank you so much.